Alright, I know I said that in the final episode we'd be talking about the behind-the-scenes stuff, but before we got to that, there's still a couple of things I want to say about the movie itself. These are things that I wanted to say for the end because I believe they need to be spoken on in a specific order instead of just doing it when we got to a particular scene in the movie. So I spent a lot of time going over the movie itself, analyzing many of the problems within its writing. The badly paced story, the continuity errors, the disservice to the characters, it was all just awful. But I still think there's a couple of more things to say about each specific element, and I want to do it in an order that best suits me instead of just doing it scene by scene. I know there's a couple of other things that people wanted me to nitpick, like bombs being dropped in space, Finn being an expert pilot despite that he had no proper flight training in between movies, or paper existing in the Star Wars universe despite that Lucas himself said that Star Wars is a paperless world. I didn't bring this kind of stuff up because I saw these little things as moot points compared to everything else going on. I mainly wanted to talk about the much more damaging elements of the movie because of how much more directly they were involved in the actual storytelling, and how badly they damaged the integrity of the Star Wars universe. And besides what I talked about so far, there's still a couple of more things about the movie itself besides the behind-the-scenes stuff that just feel wrong. Firstly, The Last Jedi really doesn't serve the original trilogy justice, because most of the movie revolves around the First Order dominating the galaxy and the rebels being on their last legs. It makes all of the accomplishments made in the original trilogy feel hollow and meaningless. It acts like everything Luke, Han, and Leia went through and fought for doesn't matter anymore because most of the impact they left is just gone. And with the original cast gone or their characters dead, it reduces anticipation for what happens next. Another thing about The Last Jedi that just really bothers me is that because of how badly the story was executed, there's practically nothing to look forward to in Episode 9. Due to the way that Snoke is just killed off and the First Order is taken over by a less experienced man-child, it completely robs the suspense of the final battle in Episode 9. Because the First Order has been defeated twice at this point, there is no tension. Why should I worry about the possibility that the good guys may lose? Rey has never lost and continues to become more powerful, so what is there to look forward to when Episode 9 is announced? I mean, they must want us to anticipate something because they end on such an optimistic cliffhanger despite how absolutely fucked the rebels are. It's like they wanted to make a movie about the rebels being decimated but still wanted to shoehorn in a happy ending. In that last moment, Leia was literally telling us, hey, we might have gotten our asses kicked, but everything will be okay. Why exactly is everyone acting happy and celebrating at the end? Despite the fact that most of their friends are dead, the Resistance is practically destroyed, and their allies abandoned them, they're still standing around smiling like everything is alright. A huge problem that The Last Jedi has is that it not only disregards the original trilogy, it also disregards The Force Awakens, the very movie that it's supposed to be a sequel to. The Last Jedi is all setup and no payoff. So many things that were shown to be important in The Force Awakens are just dropped and hand-waved away in this movie. Rey's heritage, keeping the map to Luke Skywalker away from the Order, finding Luke before the Order did, the weight of Luke seeing his lightsaber being brought back to him, Snoke's presence as the main villain, Rey going to Luke to get her training, Finn's injuries at the end of the last movie, and a whole bunch of other stuff that would require its own supplementary video in order to properly go over each of them. This was a sequel that completely forgot about the existence of the first movie, or even worse, it did know about the first movie and just didn't give a shit. And I guess that brings us back to the Mary Sue thing. The main reason Rey fails to be relatable in this movie is that it's completely impossible to do so. To find out that she's just some nobody who can do whatever she wants is both a huge letdown from the build-up we got from The Force Awakens, and it just makes no sense. No one can relate to that because it's impossible to be like a person who can just do whatever they want without earning it. If Rey was a villain, it would make more sense because the villain is meant to be an obstacle for the heroes to overcome. But when they're the main protagonist of the story that you're supposed to identify with, it takes away the feeling of familiarity. She has no understandable backstory, no conceivable struggle. She's just this perfect little Barbie doll who can do anything regardless of how much sense it makes. Remember that scene where she became a professional with the Falcon's gun and I said that she was just as good as Han Solo? Well, I actually got that wrong. She's better than Han Solo because on her first try, she manages to kill not one, not two, but 3 TIE fighters with a single shot. We never saw her managing the cannons of the Falcon before, so her sudden experience in using them, especially in such a ludicrous degree, makes no sense. Some people have told me that in the tie-in book that it's actually revealed that Rey has the power to obtain Force abilities and powers from other Force users simply by touching them. So, is that supposed to be the explanation for her powers? Because that just makes her look even more like a Mary Sue. And it still doesn't make sense because I highly doubt that the Force or the stupid midichlorians have anything to do with how she can swim, gun the Falcon like a pro, or have better knowledge in fixing the Falcon than Han Solo. Even if it is possible for a Force user to get stronger by transmitting the abilities of other Force users through physical contact, how exactly is that supposed to work? If it's based on the midichlorian count, do the midichlorians clone themselves and somehow enter her bloodstream? And how fast can they travel from one body to another? Do they travel so fast that Rey can obtain them by simply giving someone a high five? And why would Rey, and only Rey, have the ability to increase her midichlorian count simply by touching another Force user? You starting to see how the midichlorian speech is bullshit now? The ability to obtain Force powers by touching another Force user was never conceived at any other point in the franchise. It was clearly something that was made up for the sake of making Rey out to be this undefeatable champion. But if you want to make Rey this undefeatable champion, it takes away the logic behind her being Luke's successor and replacement. They're making her the new Luke without any understanding as to what makes Luke such a good character in the original trilogy. Do you want to know why Luke was such a good character? Because he's actually relatable. When Star Wars first came out, the main appeal to Luke Skywalker was that he was in the shoes of the audience. He was a free-spirited person who dreamed of adventure, traveling to far-off lands in search of discovery. Kind of like audiences seeking adventure and thrills through watching a movie that was very revolutionary at the time. Throughout his adventures, Luke progressively learned about the world around him. He learned about the Force from both Obi-Wan and Yoda, and he needed to grow from each experience in order to fight the Empire. And because of the idea that he was in the shoes of the audience in the beginning, you get the sensation that Luke and the audience were growing alongside each other as they learned more about the world of Star Wars, making for a more memorable connection. Also, remember how I said that Rey never loses? Well, compare that to Luke, who actually ends up losing at the end of The Empire Strikes Back. He was defeated by Vader because he was acting too careless, which cost him his right hand. What made Luke losing to Vader the first time so important is that it was a loss that he needed to learn from. He had to learn that he just can't rush into battle. He needs to have a clear mind, balance out his emotions, and further his Jedi training in order to be properly prepared. That's what he ends up learning in Return of the Jedi. Luke had to learn from his defeat against Vader in order to improve, and after improving he was able to defeat him, helping him with his change of heart and ultimately defeating the Emperor. Luke wasn't a Mary Sue because he didn't just get everything handed to him on a silver platter. You get the sensation that he had to work for all of his talents and experiences as a warrior. Now look at Rey, who never loses. Because she never loses, she never has to learn anything. And because she doesn't have to learn anything, she doesn't need to improve. There's no real struggle, so there's no reason to feel invested in what she's going through. She almost always wins, so there's literally no suspense in it. This is what makes a lot of people consider her a Mary Sue. Her abilities were given to her out of nowhere with no in-universe explanation, and she didn't even have to go through any extensive training to be on par with Obi-Wan. When you have any random Joe using the Force without any explanation or training, you're completely devolving the Force into something that isn't special. Now it's just something that anyone can use whenever it's convenient for the plot. Rey isn't just a Mary Sue, she redefines the Mary Sue. It's practically made out to be the message of The Last Jedi. It doesn't matter what her skill sets are or what her level of training is, all that matters is that she has the Force and you have to deal with it. She was supposed to learn about the importance of being a Jedi in order to properly harness the power and responsibility that came with it. She never learned anything from Luke or the textbooks about the actual weight of being a Jedi, and for no reason whatsoever, she's still given the title. Why is Rey being trusted with the responsibility of a legacy she clearly doesn't understand? Even if Luke was to come back as one of those blue ghosts, the way the movie ends is telling us that both Luke and Yoda believe that there's nothing left to teach Rey. Again, if you wanted to do a lesson about how it's what's inside that counts, you should have had Luke be more direct with Rey. Have more scenes of the two interacting with each other. Actually have him teaching her something that she didn't already know before coming to the island. Speaking of Luke, there's still a couple of more things I want to say about his character. I know I've talked a lot about it already, but this portrayal is literally so bad that I cannot possibly imagine why anyone would think this was okay. Character assassination doesn't even begin to describe it. When Rey, a completely random character who was brought into the story mere days of the events of The Force Awakens with no prior connection to anyone, is far more concerned in saving Ben and fighting to protect the galaxy than Luke Skywalker, a character who was defined by his loyalty, you know something somewhere went horribly wrong. That scene where he had that fleeting instinct of killing his sleeping nephew should have been the very moment where someone went up to Rian Johnson and said right in his face, "We are redoing this fucking script." I mean, if Luke was still connected to the Force at the time he sensed Ben's darkness, why did he not take the moment to get advice from Yoda or Obi-Wan or Anakin to properly talk things over with him? Luke became a Jedi unlike any other because he achieved something that no other Jedi had done before. He had feelings and emotions, and he strived to teach other people how to accept them. Luke is like Anakin if he managed to balance out his emotions. In this film, you constantly get the sensation that Luke is denying all of his emotions for anything going on, thus abandoning his own teachings. And at no point does the movie even come close to justifying his new attitude. I could understand Luke abandoning the Jedi way and going through depression and post-traumatic stress disorder if something really unspeakable and horrifying happened, like seeing his family and friends being brutally murdered and he wasn't able to stop it because he wasn't strong enough. That would have made for a good reason for Luke to isolate himself. This was something that Luke could have stopped. This was a situation that he had far more control over. Ben didn't even do anything wrong yet. He could have easily taken that moment to talk some sense into him, and the aftermath of the situation isn't even that big of a deal. The temple was burning and Ben killed some of the people he was training. Well, so what? Is this really the worst thing that has ever happened to Luke? There's a reason why I don't believe in Luke cutting himself from the Force for a single second, no matter how many people have said that it's explained in the movie. By cutting himself off from the Force, he's abandoning his sister, his friends, and choosing to ignore the rest of the galaxy as it's getting blown up and enslaved by the Order. That is not something that Luke Skywalker would ever do. He wouldn't just choose to abandon everyone and leave them to clean up the mess he made. And the moment where Luke goes over the hypocrisy of the Jedi also just feels wrong. If I recall, Palpatine's plans to bring the Empire to power was part of a plan that the Sith were progressively building upon over 1,000 years. Palpatine simply did his part in climbing the ranks of the politics and manipulating the Jedi to expose their weaknesses. Why didn't Luke just teach Rey about learning from the history and improving upon the flaws of the Council? He doesn't even bring up any significant flaws in the old Jedi way, or the Council, or how poorly they dealt with the issues involving Anakin in the first place. If you're going to reference the prequels, you have to at least go further than the most bare bones of detail. It just feels like throughout the entire film, his motivations are constantly flip-flopping, going back and forth as if he's not even sure what he's working towards. What makes it even worse is that Luke has absolutely no purpose in the story. He does nothing of value, he stays on the island throughout the film, and he ends up dying, which gets rid of any further potential he could have offered. Had Luke just trained Rey like he was supposed to, he would have had some kind of purpose other than being a broken down husk of a man. The least he could have done was carry his X-Wing out of the water, repair it, and use it to fly back and regroup with the others. If he was going to die anyway, what was the point of staying on the island? If you cut Luke out of this movie, it wouldn't have made any difference because he really doesn't have any effect on any of the events. Rey was coming to rescue them with that rock-lifting trick anyway, and the rebels escaped by following some random crystal dogs to a secure part of the cave. Last Jedi Luke performs an absolute 180 on the character we knew him for in the original trilogy, devolving him into this cranky, cowardly idiot. This characterization is an act of betrayal to everyone who saw him as a hero. He's not in any rhyme or reason or any form of logic the same character from episodes 4 through 6. Luke's portrayal in this film was a primary example of Johnson and Kennedy having no prior knowledge of the series, and just went out of their way to slap it in the face to make this new generation of Star Wars look like a masterpiece of progressive storytelling. Next we have Kylo Ren. I know that a lot of people weren't fans of him in The Force Awakens, but it still served as a reasonable introduction to his character. And just like everything else that was introduced in The Force Awakens, what they end up doing with Kylo Ren in this movie is just about as uninteresting and boring as it can get. I didn't think it was possible, but by the start of the third act, he manages to be a bigger brat than Episode 2 Anakin. Because of how jumbled and inconsistent his character is, he's just not intimidating. Even when they give him moments of interesting depth, they somehow find a way to ruin it. They contradict his growth as a character and just keep him as this angsty, tempered, and irrational idiot. The guy got his ass kicked by Rey in the last movie, and now he's trying to pick a fight with a Jedi Master? If I got my ass kicked by an untrained kid, I certainly wouldn't be looking to pick a fight with Dwayne Johnson. and his relationship with Snoke just feels confusing. He seemed to be on even terms with him in the last movie, and now there's this back and forth with Snoke not liking him, but then he suddenly likes him again. Apparently because Rey chose to turn herself in, which really didn't have anything to do with Kylo. One of his worst scenes by far is definitely where he tells his troops to continuously fire on Luke, which flanderizes his character beyond belief and makes you question why anyone is taking orders from him. He ordered every single gun to fire on Luke and continues to have them fire at him until he's turned to ash, all while clenching his fist and getting distracted and giving the enemy a chance to escape. This is something that you do to a person that you completely despise beyond all logic. At least Hux was less irrational, and he was made into the butt of everyone's jokes in this movie. As for Hux himself, it's really embarrassing the way he's portrayed in this movie. In The Force Awakens, he had a much calmer presentation, acting as the antithesis to Kylo to keep him under control. Now he's been reduced to this bumbling, yelling idiot who's easily thwarted by a prank call. And I still can't get over how they so arbitrarily killed off Snoke for no rhyme or reason. It's supposed to come across as this huge subverting plot twist because Rian Johnson wanted to subvert expectations, but it's a decision that falls completely flat narrative-wise. I mean, with Snoke dead before the final battle of the second movie, he has to be replaced by someone in order for there to be any sort of conflict. And you choose to replace him with someone who is less powerful, got his ass kicked in the first film, wasn't even done with his training yet, and is a complete idiot who's easily distracted by his irrational emotions. And no, I'm not gonna let go of the fact that they did nothing to give Snoke a backstory. This is a guy who crippled 30 years of peace and was shown to be more powerful than Palpatine. I don't care what's been said about being mysterious or ambiguous or not repeating from the original trilogy or whatever. When you introduce a character that powerful and that big of a threat to the heroes, you need to give him some form of background. He was a crucial and important part of the story. We didn't need a whole autobiography on him, but we still needed something. Now, we all know that the Finn and Rose subplot was complete shit, but the whole Holdo versus Poe thing really didn't make it any better. What really gets under my skin with this character is how, despite how fucking horribly she was written, she's apparently supposed to be a role model for girls and women to take after. They try to make her out to be this strong, smart, and capable person, but she ends up being portrayed as irrational, idiotic, condescending, and above all other things, a terrible leader. A role model character is being portrayed as a fucking terrible leader. Another annoying thing about it is that it seems to portray Poe as this complete idiot who's constantly messing everything up. But when you really look at it, he has every single right to question Holdo. From his point of view, she was leading them to certain death. And why? Because in all the times and opportunities that she had to tell anyone other than that blonde lady what her plan was, she never tells anyone what she was planning to do. Holdo has absolutely no motivation to not tell Poe what her plan was. In their very first scene together, Poe takes the moment to simply ask Holdo what her plan was. He asks a very simple question with a reasonably patient tone. And what does Holdo do? She tells him to fuck off and throws his hot-headedness in his face, even though it literally just saved everyone since the Dreadnought would have followed them and blown them up on the spot. And she has the nerve to tell Poe that he was the one who put everyone at risk? She put her own plan in jeopardy by not telling anyone about it except for another woman, Kathleen Kennedy, even at the most crucial of times where it would have helped everyone. Being a leader is literally in her job, and part of that job is keeping people's morality high. And instead of doing that, she leaves people in the dark about something vastly important while throwing potshots at Poe. Why? Why did she think this was going to help? This is a very desperate situation they're in, and when your subordinates start to panic, at some point you need to tell them something concrete. Some people have tried to defend Holdo's idiocy by saying that she shouldn't have to tell Poe the plan because of his hot-headedness, which is the shittiest defense that I've been hearing for this part of the movie. His hot-headedness just saved the fleet from being destroyed by the Dreadnought, and he was acting pretty calm when he first asked her what was going on. In the end, it really doesn't matter if Poe was being hot-headed or not. By refusing to tell anyone anything, Holdo was completely failing her job as a commander. Follow your orders? What fucking orders? You've told him absolutely nothing to give him any reason to believe that you're worth trusting. You might try to justify this by saying that you have to respect the chain of command, but when your superior is doing absolutely nothing to improve the situation, something is going to look suspicious. To put it simply, Poe did nothing wrong, and for the movie to make him look irrational compared to Holdo is absolutely insulting. I know that a lot of people hate Rose, but from a logical standpoint, standpoint and a storytelling standpoint, Holdo is just so much worse. She's far more insulting than Rose because she's not only horribly written, but that horrible writing is supposed to make her an idol for girls to take after. And she represents some of the most offensive and toxic of Kathleen Kennedy's views, which we will be getting to later. And finally, we get to talk about what's widely referred to as the worst parts of the movie, the Finn and Rose subplot. Unlike the rest of the stuff in the movie, which at least had some kind of connection to the story and the development of the characters, everything about the Finn and Rose subplot is inconsequential filler that has absolutely nothing to do with anything. It is completely 100% pointless. Whether it's further proving how Holdo is an idiot for not telling Poe about her plan, shoehorning in Maz and Phasma for the sake of fan service, that shitty trip to the casino, or ultimately being a huge waste of time since Poe's plan to escape through lightspeed gets retconned, these two don't do anything to justify the amount of screen time they get. They barely interact with any of the other characters, and the hacker guy ends up getting killed anyway. What really makes this subplot so useless is that both Finn and Rose come across as completely wasted potential. Despite being used for comic relief, Finn in The Force Awakens was a good character. He had an interesting story arc going for him, overcoming his fears of the war and learning how to be brave. Finn was our chance to see the First Order from a stormtrooper's perspective, and they were doing a good job developing him. But in The Last Jedi, he ends up playing second fiddle to Rose, who's clearly shoved into the plot for the sake of meeting the diversity quota. And in all the time that he's with her, he's just standing around. Like the movie doesn't know what the hell to do with him. Don't you think we could have gotten something more interesting than this? We could have gotten a fun subplot about Finn and Poe going on some kind of secret mission, infiltrating the First Order, getting some blueprints to their ships and weapons, or spy on them to get information on their tactical plans. But instead, Poe has to deal with this grinning asswipe, and Finn gets annoyingly downplayed so that this irritating woman can hog the spotlight. Even that scene where he was going to heroically sacrifice himself, that would have been a really great moment for him. It would have given Finn more of a reason to be in the film, adding nuance and meaning to his character. And they even managed to screw that up, because they needed to keep shoving Rose in our fucking faces. Rose is simply not an interesting character. Aside from the personality disorder, she comes across as incredibly stupid and hypocritical. A lot of her scenes try to use her as a means to push the film's agenda and making her look like this misunderstood, tragic figure. The problem with that is that she's almost always going against her own philosophies and poorly justifying her actions. She treats the memory of her sister as a huge deal and wants to honor her sacrifice, but in several scenes she seems to care more about saving some space horses and her underdeveloped relationship with Finn, and getting back at some rich jackasses than staying focused on the mission. I mean, look at this. She's having fun and laughing and taking this far too lightly in the middle of a do-or-die mission to save the Resistance. I mean, I hate people who only care about money as much as the next guy, but the way it's done in this movie feels really out of place. It pushes forward this anti-capitalist agenda in a way that jeopardizes the themes and message of the story. It talks about how the rich people are evil because they're profiting from the war by selling weapons to the First Order, but as we see later on, they've been selling weapons to both sides. They're not exactly on the First Order side, and they certainly didn't cause the war. It's just a business that they live on. Now, it's true that profiting from war is a scummy thing to do, and the movie could have had a good message about it, but because of the way it's being told through Rose's perspective, it's clearly not the message they're going for. It doesn't focus nearly enough on both sides of the issue and just goes with this generic black and white mentality. It's all about how these people are bad and we need to give them what for by setting off a stampede in the city. But what about the people over there who are not weapons dealers, who have nothing to do with the war profiting? What about the janitors or the casino employees or the child slaves or any of the residents who are simply renting a room? Those people who have nothing to do with that speech by Rose could have easily been put in danger as a result of her actions, and the film does nothing to acknowledge this. Rose could have been an interesting character if she was utilized properly, but she's just so annoyingly portrayed and so badly written with her inconsistent personality and dumbass decisions that it's impossible to relate to her on any level. But even if you were to put all of that aside, the stupid casino trip, the mission to sneak onto the enemy ship, the dumb anti-capitalist message, or Rose's inconsistent personality, the subplot with Finn and Rose still suffers from one consistent problem. At least half of the film is spent on the two spending time together and building what I think is supposed to be a relationship, just so we can have a scene of them kissing kissing at the end to establish them as a couple. It's at this moment that The Last Jedi suffers from a storytelling trick that I have absolutely hated ever since the final 3 episodes of Samurai Jack. It starts treating the romance as this vastly important thing that needs to have all of the attention put into it at the expense of everything else going on. Now, romance by itself is not a bad thing. It can be interesting if it's properly used to drive the story forward, if it's the core of the story or otherwise. However, the Finn and Rose subplot is seen as a small portion of a much larger story. It's a space opera about a band of rebels fighting against an oppressive government. And because there's no moment of actual affection between these two, there's no reason for them to have a romance. It's completely forced onto us and gets in the way of much more important stuff going on in the movie. I said that this would have been better if it was saved for a tie-in comic or a spin-off book or a video game, because there would have been a wider range of freedom to tell this romantic side story. It would have been separated from the movies and the grander storyline, so it could have freely been about something trivial. But because it makes up too much of a plot that revolves around Rey, Luke, Kylo, Poe, Holdo, and Leia, all of whom are given their own character-grounded story arcs, the romance feels out of place, unwanted, and it completely interferes with the growth of the narrative. And with that, I've pretty much said everything that I can about the film on its own. But what about all the behind-the-scenes stuff? What about all of the crap that Rian Johnson and Kathleen Kennedy were behind in the making of this film? Well, I believe that the shit that these two pulled is so stupid, so complicated, and so downright insulting that it's a subject that deserves its own separate video. We're almost there, folks. Just 2 more problems to talk about and it'll finally be over.